I'm pleased to be joined by Jennifer March-Joly, recently appointed Executive Director of the Citizens Committee for Children of New York. Welcome to CityWide.
Good morning.
So who are these citizens? Why do they have a committee? And what's this got to do with children?
Well, 64 years ago, several prominent New Yorkers, one of them being Eleanor Roosevelt, founded Citizens Committee for Children because they believed that citizens could be change makers in the city of New York. And at that time, they were particularly concerned about women entering the workforce and there being really no entity that could ensure that children were safe and well cared for while their mothers entered employment. And their advocacy led to the creation of the city's subsidized child care system. Since then, our mission has evolved to ensure that all New York City's children are healthy, housed, educated, and safe. And we engage New Yorkers and the citizenry at large to make that case in New York City and New York State.
So how's New York City doing?
New York City is doing very well, but our big challenge really is that while health is improving for children, educational outcomes are improving, we're seeing more robust service delivery systems across the city. Many children in particular neighborhoods are kind of left out of progress, particularly children of color. So our big challenge really today is to combat poverty and to make sure that we give children and families in New York City the tools they need to really overcome the barriers that prevent them from participating more fully in society.
Give us an example of how that plays out in a child's daily life. You're a 10-year-old girl, you're living in a poor neighborhood. What's, obviously, aside from the fact that you're poor, what does it mean in terms of the quality of your life, and what can government do about that?
Well, a simple example would be, do all children have access to adequate nutrition, and can their families afford to buy healthy food, and is food readily available in their communities? It's widely recognized that children that eat well and have a healthy diet perform better in school and have better health outcomes. So our challenge is, how do we engage state and local policymakers in a discussion that would allow us to identify policy opportunities and programmatic investments that would bring food to communities that lack access?
So, New York City seems to be such a city of abundance and robustness now. Are you saying that there are places in New York where kids are malnourished because they don't have access to quality food?
I wouldn't say malnourished. I would say that they have the wrong diet, and that it's often inconvenient for their parents to access nutritious, affordable food in their immediate community. We did focus groups in the South Bronx and parts of Brooklyn where family members actually take 2 and 3 buses or multiple trains to try to do a large shop for large quantities at more affordable retailers and then bring them home. It's really burdensome when many of these families work multiple jobs and really don't have the time or the money to make that, take that extra step.
To what extent is the city's agenda for young people driven by these kinds of policy initiatives? You mentioned healthcare is an area where there's been some improvement. That was the result of some pushes in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. Do policymakers focus on these problems just because the problems reach a certain critical mass, or is it organizations like yours that drive the debate?
I think both. I think often when crises arise, as they do in different areas, child welfare being one of them, unfortunately, it's often an opportunity to refocus and engage on a particular issue and to revisit things that we thought were fixed that we can do better on. I think in child policy areas, there's never really enough. The business is never really finished. You can always do more and do better for children.
And ACS as an agency, they're supposed to protect children from abusive situations. But then we have these horror stories of kids who were within the radar screen of the system, but somehow managed to fall through the cracks. What needs to be done specifically with respect to the foster care system and how we protect vulnerable children?
Well, I think that they've done an enormous amount over the last 2 years after that peak of several fatalities to really look at the front door of the child welfare system. Are we investigating all cases, calls of abuse and neglect in a timely fashion? Do we have appropriate training for people on the ground that have to make difficult decisions often in the wee hours of the night about the safety of children in particular homes? Do they have proper supervision? Do they have police reinforcement? Those things are good, but I think as well we need to look broader at the community level and what resources exist in communities to really prevent risk from creeping up in particular households and ensure that these families are stable, intact, and strengthened. And that's a real challenge. Ironically, preventive services is often, I think, in the public realm, less easy to understand because it's things like counseling, parent engagement, after-school programs, mentoring. It's softer things than investigating a case of abuse and neglect and determining whether or not a child was harmed. The other interesting thing about the child welfare system is there are many, many things outside of its control that impact the stability of a household. We just surveyed preventive service programs across the city, and what we found was the greatest shortage of services were in the areas of mental health, which aren't technically a reimbursable service under prevention, and housing, affordable housing. So the challenge is how do you really ensure that each community has the resources it needs so that families thrive, whether that's food, housing, mental health services.
The New York Times recently did what I thought was a remarkable series about a decision by city policymakers some years ago to focus foster care resources on agencies that came from communities of color, that were led by members of the Black and Latino community, and on the theory that they would be more culturally sensitive. But what the story revealed was, in many cases, those organizations didn't have the managerial skills to meet the challenges that they were asked to be faced, and that the situation was exacerbated by the fact that they were protected by the political leaders from their community from the kind of organizational oversight that might otherwise have been appropriate.
Right.
What struck me about the story was not the sort of the policy and personal issues being played out, but the fact that it seemed to have disappeared without a ripple. It was a major story, New York Times, obviously a lot of work gone into it. I don't remember a single elected official having a press conference about it, no public hearings about it, not even an editorial. What happened?
Right. I think it's interesting. A lot of us in the advocacy and research community asked ourselves why now, because the story to many of us was really old news. It was something we had experienced in the wake of those closings several years ago. And I thought also what was interesting about the stories is it really didn't talk about some of the things that concerned us most. Well, first, many other agencies closed that weren't headed by executives of color, which we thought was slightly unfair. But the second thing was it didn't really get into why is foster care such a difficult business. And, you know, there are state funding structures that really don't adequately reimburse for board and care or for health care for children in the custody of these agencies. And it's a real challenge for New York City.
Education has been a focus of the Bloomberg administration. We went through a period, I think, of turmoil with the old Board of Education in the Giuliani years, with chancellors coming and going. Joel Klein has been there as long as the mayor has. More resources, some debate about how successful all the reforms have been, but clearly there's been a huge focus on education. Has that blocked out the sun as far as other issues affecting children? In other words, has the education, the Department of Education, attracted so much attention that that issues like foster care or after-school programs or the like are just not being addressed?
Yes and no. I mean, because the education budget obviously is quite large in the city. But I think in some way, what's appealing about education is it's a universal issue. And it's interesting that CCC often tries to take the tack, what do all children need? So you want a quality education, but at the same time, how do we use what we've learned from that messaging around a quality education and what all New York City children should have, to influence universal pre-K and making sure all 4-year-olds have a UPK slot, or childcare. You know, if education is so important, how do we begin to invest more wisely from 0 to 3 to make sure we have a quality childcare system in New York? So I think in some ways, thematically, this focus on different policy areas that are universally accepted as, you know, they should be of quality and there for every child in New York City, helps us really leverage other issues that are quite similar.
When the Dinkins administration and the City Council under Peter Vallone adopted the Safe Cities, Safe Streets program in 1991 or so, one of the things they did obviously was to increase the size of the police department, and that is credited with having a direct impact on the reduction in crime. But the other thing they did was call for an expansion of youth services. After school programs and community-based organizations received a spurt of funding. Is there any evidence that those youth services, that expansion of services at that time, had anything to do with the reduction in crime in New York?
That's a really good question. I mean, we always say that you know, it's better to have a child engaged from 3 to 6 in a structured activity that helps them get homework help and learn a different skill, or, you know, play a sport, than to have them standing on the street corner. So our assumption is yes.
But what percentage do you think of kids get those services from 3 to 6 in the city? Well,
not enough, unfortunately. And in fact, a couple years ago when the city was revisiting out-of-school time, which they now call youth services, CCC did a citywide poll of parents asking, you know, is your child currently enrolled in an after-school activity? If they are, would you like additional services? And if they're not, would you use them if they were made available? And from that poll, we calculated close to 450,000 children need but don't have out-of-school time services.
CityWide will continue right after this.
This is my family. That's my mom and dad. And my brother. And that's me, future Hall of Famer. That's Grandpa. He's my best friend. Grandpa's got diabetes, but he's got it under control.
I keep my blood sugar close to normal. That means I watch what I eat and walk every day. I always take my medicine and test my blood sugar because I want to be around to see the next Jackie Robinson.
Control your diabetes for life. Call 1-800-438-5383.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Jennifer March-Joly, the Executive Director of the Citizens Committee for Children. We were talking before the break about the impact of youth services on crime. Let's talk a little bit about the impact of the juvenile justice system on kids. We have separate courts for young people. We have separate jails for young people. Does New York City do a good job of juvenile justice?
Yes and no. I think the challenge in the city and across the state is what we're finding: programs that have better outcomes and lower rates of recidivism, meaning community-based alternatives to detention and incarceration, really aren't a reimbursable service by the state of New York, so localities have to foot the entire bill, which makes it a challenge to expand those programs that are most effective.
Wait a second. You're saying that there are things that are better for kids, but the city doesn't get any money for them from the state, which will pay for a jail, and therefore we're not providing those services?
Correct. I mean, over the last 5 years, the state has slowly tried to close facilities that are underutilized for youth and reinvest those services in alternatives to detention. Right now, we're paying close to $200,000 a year for a child in a state detention placement with an 80% recidivism rate. And community-based alternatives have a recidivism rate of less than 50% and cost a quarter of that.
But isn't that also a function of where kids are diverted to? In other words, aren't the most dangerous and incorrigible kids the ones that are sent to jail, and the ones that are most likely to be recoverable sent to the alternative programs?
Not really. I mean, the problem is while it's beginning to be widely recognized across the nation that you need to invest in these alternatives, there's no real infrastructure yet to give the judge really an array of choices, and so the choice of preference still is state detention because that's what exists.
One of the research projects that your organization did recently had to do particularly with how girls are treated in the juvenile justice system. What did you find?
Well, it's interesting because we don't typically look at the needs of boys, separate the needs of boys from girls, but we were asked to look particularly at young women in the juvenile justice system because we found that they commit very different crimes. They're often relationship crimes. They often have a history of abuse, neglect. There are often issues in the household with, different male in the household that is not a parent. They've been often subject to lots of dating violence and whatnot. So we looked to see whether or not the system was cognizant of the trauma that many of these girls experience in life and what encouraged them to actually commit crimes, and whether or not there were appropriate services in detention to address those needs. And we found in large part, no. There's not a lot about sexual health. There's not a lot about peer mentoring and positive relationship development. And there wasn't a lot of robust training of staff to make sure that male and female staff that interacted with these young women really did so in a positive, healthy way.
To what extent do you find the political, governmental establishment as consumers of policy, driven by data as opposed to what might just be the popular issue of the day? I'll give you an example. Some years ago, all the rage was predator kids, that we were going to raise a generation of out-of-control, super criminal predator kids that were going to be roaming around in, wolf packs around the city. That doesn't seem to have materialized, but for a while it was driving juvenile justice policy.
Right.
Your organization does a lot of survey research, data analysis. Do the facts matter to a politician?
I think so. I mean, every 2 years we produce Keeping Track of New York City's Children, which gives every local elected official over 300 indicators on child well-being for their particular district. And it's really compelling when you can paint a picture of children and families living in someone's district and compare them to the rest of New York City and say, look, your kids, your constituents are clearly falling behind on X, Y, and Z issue. And then often you just wait for the right time to kind of cinch the deal.
So tell me a little bit more about what your day-to-day work is like as an advocate.
Well, we have I like to say we have 3 different components of our work. We document the facts, so we do an enormous amount of survey research, focus groups, and data collection of government data and evaluate government programs. We educate the public, so once we have those facts, how do we get the information into the hands of local elected officials and New Yorkers, and then how do we advocate for change? So we try to be strategic about who do we need to get the information to influence, and how do we bring New Yorkers into that process so that they can email their local elected official, visit their local elected official with us. So because we believe that the facts have bearing, but there's also power in numbers.
There's also a school of thought that says it's easier to organize against something than to organize for something. It's easier to organize against cuts in youth services than to organize in favor of spending more money, particularly when you're competing with so many other worthwhile areas, some of which may affect children, like healthcare, and others may not. Talk about that challenge a little bit.
Well, I think it's appropriate right now, since the state and city are facing a fiscal deficit. The pressure will be, what energy do we place on maintaining what exists, and then how do we continue to be aspirational? And I actually believe in times like this, it's much more important for government to make sure it's making wise decisions and investing in programs that produce positive outcomes for youth. So you have to be persistent and patient, and you have to go back year in and year out to advance your cause and hope that eventually the time will be right to advance a particular issue.
Do you think that the aging baby boomers like me are going to change the debate where we're going to be more concerned about services for seniors than for kids?
Well, I think that the aging community is a very powerful, I wouldn't include you in that group, but is a very powerful constituency, and our goal really as child advocates is to have children compete at the same level and gain the same amount of attention from local legislators, because they in fact do not vote.
One of the national debates, I think, that is going to come into focus as we get closer to the presidential election has to do with the role of government versus the role of family and community. Is it always a governmental solution to the challenges facing children?
No, but I think that government is an incredible force of good throughout our history, and you know, should be responsive to children and families that are, in fact, the local constituency.
Let's take immigration as an example of that. Again, playing out on the national stage, do you provide services to people who entered the country legally but overstayed their visas or entered the country illegally? School of thought that was prevalent in New York for a long time was that you don't penalize the kids because what their parents did, and they're going to be here anyway, so they need services. Others say that merely encourages more undocumented folks to enter the country and to take services away from the families who are paying the taxes for them. Does your group have a position on that?
You know, we haven't really weighed in on that, but I would say there's always going to be a push-pull factor for people immigrating to the United States, and I don't truthfully believe it's in order to gain access to social service benefits. It's to have a job, to make sure that their children have opportunity and a chance at greater success in life than they may have had in the country of origin. So I think it's really important to ensure that, you know, those families can succeed here and do so legally, one would prefer.
So looking down the road through 2008, what do you think is the single biggest challenge facing children that New York City can do something about?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think one of the greatest opportunities is really focusing on economic and developmental security. I think that there are proven, you know, it's clear that children that come from households with wealth and assets do better in the long run than children that come from families without assets and wealth. They have better health, education, labor force participation, and they succeed in general in life. And I think that kind of continuing along the Mayor Bloomberg's success in piloting anti-poverty demonstration programs, we really need to think bigger about what can we do to ensure that all children in New York City have an opportunity to build wealth over time. Something as simple as a children's savings account could government establish with a small deposit, and then encourage people to begin to save and learn about financial literacy and actually have different choices at age 18 if those monies could be made available then. Investments that would probably pay off for all of us as well. My thanks to Jennifer March-Joly, the Executive Director of the Citizens Committee for Children of New York. I'm Ken Fisher. Thank you for joining us on this edition of CityWide.